What if this is actually setting a precedent of prophecies and general future predictions being a thing? Who says Sharley's the only one capable of this? Hello my fellow wannabe Straw Hats and welcome back to the One Piece saga. The series covering my never-ending journey of watching through One Piece for the very first time, giving my thoughts on it and ranking each arc in a tier list to determine which is unquestionably, definitively, and definitely not just in my opinion, the best one. But today we have an arc that turned out to be very much all over the place in terms of how I felt about it. And because of the pretty clear split in the middle of the arc, is also the first one I'll be splitting into two separate videos. So let us take a very quick look at how the tier list is looking right now and then jump right in. We got an absolutely amazing send-off into the new world with Return to Sabaody rocketing up to the top S tier. So, will our first ever proper voyage into the post-timeskip saga live up to the crew's reunion? Only one way to find out, so let us jump right into Fishman Island. Alright folks, for this one more than ever, don't be too surprised if I gloss over something because there is a ton I want to talk about. Both very good, as well as plain old bad. And because of how this arc is structured, don't be too surprised if I come off as overly negative or overly positive at times. It's just how this one turned out. But moving into the story, first and foremost, we need to talk about the things we see right after the crew leaves Sabaody, notably the brief Rayleigh flashback. And very similar to what I talked about last time, because Rayleigh is involved, you already know it's going to be big. And this one is no exception, because we see that the Straw Hat was not in fact Shanks' originally. Instead, its lineage goes back to none other than Roger himself. As far as I know and remember, this is the first time we've heard this, and retroactively, it also changes your interpretation of what Rayleigh said back in Sabaody originally. When he referred to Luffy and him wearing the hats, you'd think that he was implying Shanks, whereas in reality, he was likely talking about Roger. With what we'd find out at the end of the arc, I do have some theories regarding the significance of this new reveal, but just to keep things simple, we'll talk about that when we get there, though I'll say it now, I think this arc is already setting up something absolutely massive, and the extended lineage of the Straw Hats just reinforces that feeling. And I also don't think Fishman Island very clearly evoking Arlong Park is a coincidence. And on a similar note, we hear about Kuma and how he protected the Sunny. The gist of it is that Kuma the person made a deal with Vegapunk to program one final mission into his mind, to protect the Sunny, and so that is exactly what he did. Though this brings up many a question about both Kuma as well as Vegapunk. Firstly, why did Kuma agree to all the experiments if, at the end of the day, his allegiances still align with the revolutionaries? Quite literally, his final objective was to ensure the Straw Hats' reunion by protecting their ship, which makes his decision to essentially sell his very existence to the Navy that much more puzzling. Unless the second person in this entire puzzle is Vegapunk, who did in fact agree to help Kuma despite it clearly going against his superiors. Now, there is an important note to be made. From what we've heard, Vegapunk is a scientist through and through. As we saw in the Franky separation episodes, by the looks of it, he's not some evil mastermind. He's just trying to make the world a better place, and it's the Navy that leverages his tech to their own interests. So in the grand scheme of things, he may not have any allegiances at all, and is sort of using the Navy himself to secure funding and to further his own research. Though even with that said, going against your superiors with nothing to gain does still seem like a stretch. And on the flip side, Kuma giving up his own free will considering his true allegiances also seems like a stretch. So maybe, just maybe, they are in fact related somehow? Giving up your free will for your brother or something like that seems much more plausible. Especially if he could still ensure that his goal of helping the Straw Hats was fulfilled. But without getting caught up in the weeds too much, I am much more so curious about Vegapunk's side in this entire thing. Because sure, Kuma was a revolutionary, that makes sense. Vegapunk, on the other hand, that's the interesting part here, and his collaboration is a lot more complicated. I guess only time will tell, because that is basically all we hear about it for now. As they continue their way down to Fishman Island, as I very much expected, we get to see yet another run-in with the snake-looking dude we saw back in Sabaody. And I guess I might as well talk about him here. TLDR, I think his presence in this arc was one of convenience and not much else. I am still convinced that he's going to play a larger role moving forwards, but as of right now, he felt like a plot device that was designed to do a few very specific things and not much else. In fact, this is something I noticed quite a few times throughout the arc, which of course we'll get to later, but as of right now, he's mostly in the background and not a character I'm particularly interested in. Though soon thereafter, we see something that made me much more excited, as we hear word of the legendary Flying Dutchman. I think I've made it pretty clear by now that I'm a massive pirate legend nerd, so my eyes lit up instantly, though unfortunately, it would turn out to be very disappointing. It's here that we meet Vander Decken, and considering that he was based on a very popular legend, I expected so much more than what we got. We'll talk about this plenty more later in the arc, but very similar to what I mentioned with the snake dude, his role in this arc felt very superficial and was always overshadowed by Hordy in basically every single way. I did find his fruit power incredibly interesting, but that too didn't really prove that important in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, TLDR, not a fan of him, and sort of sad that this turned out to be the Flying Dutchman in the world of One Piece. Though shortly after, we get another incredibly interesting scene as the crew comes across this Kraken. First of all, they do of course flex on with their new powers, which was awesome. But secondly, it was already here that I began wondering about why is it that Luffy's suddenly talking to Surume and not Chopper? And as far as I'm concerned, that question would be answered at the end of this arc, where we are told that Roger could too hear the Sea Kings. And this is where you should get your tinfoil, because is this what Rayleigh meant as the voice of the universe back in Sabaody? I am a little torn on this, as we've already seen Luffy be super friendly with animals as is, so this might just be another instance of that, and more so a joke. But considering how explicitly we're told about Roger's ability to hear them, it more so seems like a confirmation that there is something more to it. And that then brings up the question of whether this was really planted all the way back in the very first filler arc Worship Island, where Luffy could hear the voice of the Celestial Dragon. Because there too I found it interesting that Apis was there with the fruit power to explicitly show you that it's not normal. So could this just be a sort of a remix where they teased something that manga readers already knew about? Or maybe, because I don't know the release schedule, could this actually be Oda having a hand in the anime fillers? We'll be talking plenty more about the implications of this later, but as of right now, I err on the side of this being the voice of the universe and that Luffy also has this ability. As to how and even if he'll be leveraging it, who knows? But judging by how the story has been structured so far, we'll find out in 300 episodes for sure. Though following all that, we see the crew finally arrive at Fishman Island, and I seriously got Skypiea vibes here. It was so different and detached from absolutely everything we'd seen so far, that it truly felt like another wild adventure where I had no clue what to expect. We're literally underwater, right? Anything goes at this point. And because I compare it to Skypiea, I do also have to say that in retrospect, this feels like a much better take on that premise. Don't get me wrong, the initial arrival on Skypiea was incredible, that's for sure, but the rest of the arc largely took place in a plain old forest. Contrast that to Fishman Island, which, despite literally being at the bottom of the ocean, which you'd think to be the darkest depths of existence, is incredibly vibrant and simply stunning. I also really like the whole world building aspect of the Sabaody trees that aren't really trees, stretching all the way down to the very depths of the sea. And in a similar vein, the whole Adam and Eve trees definitely made me raise an eyebrow. I may be a pirate nerd, but I'll say it right now, my religious knowledge is about as good as Zoro's sense of direction, so don't be too surprised if I do miss something that is a clear reference to that. Obviously we have Adam and Eve here, and we'd also see Noah, which is basically Noah's Ark, but there are no doubt countless more that will completely fly over my head. But yeah, it's more so the fact that they are referenced at all that made me very curious about what it means. And not really much else to say aside from that. I think it was just super creative, and seeing this entirely different culture was awesome. And I also loved seeing the crew just relax for a bit now that they're all back together. Probably my favorite scene of this whole introductory period was the whole Nami going shopping scene. Seeing them literally pick the place dry made me laugh a lot more than I'd like to admit. Though as they land on Fishman Island, the crew once again gets separated, which is also something we'll talk about plenty more later, but I was not a fan of right off the bat. But even more importantly, the primary plot right now revolves around Sanji's need for blood. I'll be honest, I cannot be asked to go on another rant about just how much I hated Sanji during this arc. I mean, he's literally doing more harm for the crew than good at this point, but regardless, let's tackle the whole situation here. Obviously, we see the whole nosebleed gag turn into an actual plot point, which again, I think only makes Sanji worse to be honest. But regardless, I think there is a very explicit reason why Oda went this route. In my mind, this arc's entire premise is to set up the Straw Hats as an almost unstoppable force. They've all trained for 2 years, and so they are rightfully incredibly powerful. And with that said, in my opinion, it's clear that Oda did not want to undermine that feeling by having Sanji get some major injury. Instead, he simply opted to actually make the whole nosebleed gag important, and result in him needing a transfusion without getting injured in battle. Ready for my hot take? It was clever, sure, but I think this was 100% not worth it. Obviously, it sets up the entire narrative arc we'd see with the fishmen not giving blood to humans, which would culminate in the, admittedly beautiful scene of Jimbei giving Luffy blood. But I still think that it did far more damage to Sanji than it did good for the arc. Purely from a story standpoint, do you seriously want a guy who almost dies from literally just looking at one of your friends on your crew? He is literally a liability right now. If you applied this sort of thinking to Zoro, he would accidentally lead the crew into a whirlpool which just kills them all. Without getting stuck in the weeds of trying to armchair rewrite this entire thing, I think the same thing could have been achieved not through any of the Straw Hats, but even a side character that, for one reason or another, the crew wants to protect. You could even just straight up copy what happened in Fisher's story with that little human girl. Have some random kid need a transfusion and not being able to get one. It would have drawn parallels between Luffy and Fisher, as well as made the entirety of both Fisher's as well as Otohime's stories hit that much harder. Because despite them literally giving up everything, that prejudice would still remain. Or better yet, Nami already has a tragic past with Arlong and his highly problematic worldview. Why not give her the leading role and make her try to save some kid or something because she sees herself in them? It would have empowered her and directly shown how she has overcome Arlong since those days back in the East Blue. Again, don't take this as some grand rewrite or anything. I'm simply throwing out ideas because I think there were much better ways of establishing those same themes of racism, deep-rooted prejudice, and everything else of that nature without seriously undermining Sanji's character. Especially with how much I feel like that gag was overdone already. Though we then cut to the other side of this whole thing, as we see this arc's big bad, Hordy Jones. And contrary to a lot of the negatives I just raised, Hordy is an absolutely top tier villain in my opinion. You know a bad guy's written well when it actually makes me angry seeing him. The way his views are portrayed are just realistic enough to absolutely make my blood boil. And that's what worked so well in my opinion. Though it's also here that we see him make an alliance with Decken. And again, I feel like Decken following this point was an incredibly plot convenient character that I honestly had absolutely zero interest in seeing. It's sort of weird how initially you're led to believe that both Hordy and Decken are equally dangerous, but by the end of the arc, it legitimately felt like the only reason for Decken's existence was for Hordy to have some way of threatening Fishman Island because Hordy himself was not a big threat at all. And I think that's sort of the double-edged sword part of this arc. I think Oda wanted to make the Straw Hats seem extremely overpowered, but still have some sort of stakes to the final fight. And so you just have Decken there to dangle the ship above the island. But yeah, TLDR, Hordy was a brilliant villain, but Decken was a complete blunder in my opinion. And similarly, we are introduced to Madame Sharley, whose entire purpose in this arc is also still unclear to me. At the start of the arc, we hear that she has had a vision of Luffy in some way being involved in the destruction of Fishman Island. And we also hear that her predictions have never been wrong. Number 1, this is why I'm always mixed on these sorts of characters. They appear to be all-knowing, but Sharley never even considers the fact that her vision might be true, and that it's her perspective that's wrong. It just seems extremely narrow-minded to just accept the first thing you're seeing as the definitive version of it. Obviously, these are prophecies, and you can argue that she actually saw a lot more than is shown to us as the viewer. It just seems like an easy way out to make Luffy appear as the bad guy for the time being. Number 2, when you introduce prophecies that always must be true, you immediately create the easy out of, well, it has to come true at some point, right? You literally cannot prove them wrong anymore because they're always right, right? So even if what she saw was in fact Luffy destroying the island, and not some skewed perspective of what already happened with Hordy, then it is still simply yet to happen, right? Which leads me into number 3. Most prophecies in fiction are so general that they become self-fulfilling anyway and remove any sort of intrigue surrounding it. Again, don't get me wrong. I absolutely love myself a highly ambiguous, seemingly weird and nonsensical, but actually incredibly meaningful prophecy. It's just that I find that they are very few and far between. And number 4, and perhaps most importantly, she is simply a character that is far shallower than I've grown to expect from Oda. Usually even these side characters have a lot of depth. Whereas with Sharley, it genuinely just seemed like an easy way to make Luffy seem as the bad guy. Considering that all of her prophecies seem to be extremely important, I was kind of disappointed with how small of a role she played in the arc. Again, this is Oda, so I am willing to bet that she will become important sometime later, but as of right now, it seemed like a weird thing to plan here, especially with us already seeing so little of the Straw Hats. But wait a second. What if this whole thing is actually about Luffy being so important that he literally breaks prophecies themselves? As in he will change the world to such a degree that not even all-knowing powers can predict it. Wait, hold up. What if this is actually setting a precedent of prophecies and general future predictions being a thing? Who says Sharley's the only one capable of this? If my theory regarding Dragon's plans in Sabaody are right, he's made some wild predictions too. Blackbeard too has done some very out there things, so perhaps some of these Giga Chads have more than raw strength on their side. Perhaps it's fate itself that is aiding them. And if Luffy were to upset all of that, well then wouldn't that be very interesting? Oh Oda, you cheeky man. Though skipping forward a bit, we see the crew begin to arrive at the palace, and what was supposed to be a celebration soon turns to battle as Hordy and his crew arrive as well. And one thing that I absolutely loved here was the brief duel between Hordy and Zoro. First of all, the animation here was just excellent, but in a broader sense, I think it also neatly establishes a core detail of this arc. The crew is not really in any danger, and that's a part of this arc that I actually really enjoyed. As I already said with Sanji, I think it's pretty clear that Oda wanted the crew to feel basically invincible during this first voyage into the new world. And Zoro pretty easily slicing Hordy, even underwater where he should clearly be superior, achieves that very, very well. But yeah, this shot alone was already worth it, to be honest. Cutting to Luffy's squad, we see Sanji once again being as annoying as ever, but this time he turns to stone. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but considering that his entire nosebleed thing was turned into an actual plot point, it got me wondering whether this too might actually have some additional significance. Chopper does say that it could be a side effect from receiving the Okama bloods, but it still seems like a detail that's never really expanded on, which leads me to believe that this might be one of Sanji's newly acquired powers that he's yet to fully realize. Considering Boa's Devil Fruit can achieve a very similar result, I don't think it's too big of a stretch. And remembering that his main form of fighting is martial arts, being able to turn into stone either to take a hit or deliver a stronger hit does sorta make sense. But yeah, who cares about Sanji, am I right? Once again skipping ahead a little, Luffy and his squad find their way back to the Sunny where they regroup with Franky and everyone's favorite to-be Strawhat Jimbei. And it's here where we get an absolutely incredible scene that seriously made me bust out laughing. We basically see Franky explain that the guy redoing the Sunny's coding is Tom's brother, etc, etc, only for Luffy to boil down the entire explanation to, so, he's a shipwright who's coding Franky's brother. I seriously almost died when I heard this. The seriousness of Luffy as he says it, only for us to cut to this absolute dead silence, was priceless. But anyway, you might have noticed that I've yet to bring up Shirahoshi, and that was mostly because so far, I wasn't really sure where to pin her just yet. Her dynamic with Luffy was pretty interesting, though aside from that, I really had no idea what to expect from her. That was of course until we got all the revelations at the end of the arc, because those sent my theory brain into overdrive. But more on that when we get there. I do admit her constantly crying did get a little old, though when you think about it, let's be honest, she's extremely sheltered and if anything, this is exactly how you would expect a princess to act. But yeah, even with that, her friendship with Luffy was pretty cool though. And one last thing I wanted to mention was that here too the whole Decken angle did seem like a bit of an afterthought. He sort of played into what we saw, but not really in any meaningful way whatsoever. And because the start of this arc was already pretty light, it just stood out as a pretty glaring weak point of this arc for me. Though it's when Jimbei comes into the picture that this arc is elevated to incredible heights, as basically everything following this point, for me at least, was genuinely, if not flawless, then very, very close to it. Though before we get to the flashback, I just want to say how much I appreciate the continuity here. Obviously this arc is heavily evoking those early day vibes of Arlong Park, and much of what we see from the crew is very much in the Shadow of Arlong. And that's exactly why I absolutely love that we see Nami very explicitly name him again. Considering he's one of the only big bads we didn't get to see again in Impel Down, I think Oda played it extremely well by sort of bringing him back here, not really as a threat, but rather as this looming force over Nami. So yes, big W there. Though with that, all of them gather around as Jimbei begins his story. And oh man, without a doubt, this is the strongest part of this arc. I'll be honest, I know that no matter how long I talk about it, and no matter how many times I rewrite this script, I'm not good enough with words to be able to capture the essence of their stories. But I'll at least try to make my thoughts somewhat coherent. And before we even delve any further, I sort of touched on this already, but there is one thing that this flashback gets very right straight away. And that is the fact that these episodes legitimately made me angry. And they should. They were full of generalizations, hypocrisy, tribalism, racism, and everything else of that nature that to any level-headed human being should seem ridiculous, because they are. And that's exactly what this arc captures so well. It never gets preachy about anything. It merely shows you how the sort of hatred that is very present in the real world festers. And again, it should make you angry because it is disgusting. There's no reason behind it. It's purely blind hatred, fear, and misunderstanding. And I think portraying that through the two very different perspectives of Fisher Tiger and Otohime was another wonderful decision that would make their fates hit that much harder. Because it basically shows you that no matter how or how many times you try, no single person can change that. I've mentioned many times already that I've been really surprised by the themes that One Piece chooses to tackle. And this one is 100% the epitome of that. We already got undertones of racism and tribalism in Arlong Park originally, but this arc seriously took that and spun it into something so much more complex and mature. And the thing that I think cannot be understated is how realistic the progression of that hatred is, because it begins by nothing more than a small conflict, then it becomes a generalized statement, then they take Fisher's own words and twist them to fit their own narrative, and finally, they create this echo chamber that breeds sheer toxicity. And once that core is established, they leverage the most primal thing of all: fear. And all of that culminates in what might be the most, for lack of a better word, disgusting scene of this arc. Fisher Tiger delivers the human girl home, only to have the Marines called on him by the same people who just had one of their own delivered back to them safe and sound. And again, this scene absolutely made my blood boil, because absolutely none of it is based in any reality whatsoever. It's merely blind hate, and like I've already mentioned a million times, it's that realism that is captured perfectly here. And soon thereafter, we see the scene that cemented Fisher's story as, if not the most, then certainly one of the most tragic in the entire series. Because even understanding his own message of wanting to eradicate the tribalism, he refuses human blood himself because he considers it as tainted with hate for his kind. Did this hit different? Again, I by no means consider myself as the right person to talk about this sort of stuff, but I think the message of this arc and Fisher were incredibly strong. Notably, him saying that it's only the next generation that can move past their existing prejudice. And on that note, we see Queen Otohime, who is still trying to pursue her more diplomatic way of achieving some level of mutual respect between humans and fishmen. A particular moment of interest here was the arrival of the Celestial Dragon, which, as to be expected, is the most disgusting being ever created. My notes here literally just said, okay, of course he's a cringe lord again. But anyway, Otohime hopes to reason with him and get a seat at the world government's next meeting. And of course, because he is a massive cringe lord, the noble ends up pulling a gun on the fishmen, which obviously prompts them to ready their weapons as well. And I'll be honest, when I first watched this scene, I did actually laugh out loud because they were literally shooting point blank and missed everything aside from Otohime's arm, which very much looked like Stormtroopers 2.0. Though I guess if her observation hockey really is as powerful as we saw before, then she maybe was able to somehow flip him over and be fine. But let's not get caught up on that, because obviously the importance of this scene is Otohime's sacrifice. Keep in mind that at this point, the Fishman-human relations had deteriorated a lot, and everyone knows that this cringe lord won't forget the fishmen pointing guns at him even if he initiated the conflict in the first place. Yet even in spite of all that, Otohime still put her life on the line. And again, considering that we know for a fact that her sacrifice did not achieve her goals, the tragedy of both her and Fisher putting their lives on the line time after time and ultimately dying as a direct result of them hits that much harder. But seriously, these guys are real stormtroopers. But anyway, what's more important here is that the Queen does indeed get the world government to accept the petition, and all that remains is for the public to sign it. And just as her goal finally comes within reach, that hatred that had been festering ever since Fisher's death rears its ugly head as Hordy makes his move. Of course, the cinematography and everything else in the scene was great, but this moment was absolutely brutal. In many ways, I feel like this evoked Nami's backstory, as both in her case as well as Shirahoshi's, their mothers were killed with no other reason than blind hate. Obviously, I have no clue what the community consensus is on this arc and on Hordy specifically, but if I had to wager a guess, I'd imagine many call him extremely one-note and a zealot or something along those lines. And the funny thing is, I agree with both of those statements, but personally, I think that's exactly what makes him an extremely good, realistic, and absolutely despicable villain. Because he is the embodiment of all of those themes that exist in the real world. And while that is, at times, downright uncomfortable to watch, I do think that he is a brilliant baddie. But anyway, looking at the time, I've rambled on long enough and I think this is a very good stopping point for this first part. And because we obviously won't have a tier list just yet, I do want to quickly summarize my thoughts so far. Put briefly, the range of this arc is something else entirely. We have Sanji, who literally makes my eyes turn inside out, but then we have the absolutely incredible backstory of Jimbei, Fisher Tiger, and Queen Otohime, which is not only incredibly interesting in-universe, but also, at least to my not-so-educated eye, an extremely realistic portrayal of many problems we see in society today. There's also another issue that I'd raise, and that is how little of the Straw Hats we actually see. I'll be delving into this particular aspect of the arc next time, but come on, we just followed Luffy alone for the past, 5 or 6 arcs? And then just as they meet up, we barely see any of them, not even Luffy. So while the flashback was absolutely incredible, I can't lie, I just wanted to see the crew again. But yes, with all that said, this will likely be one of the most interesting and perhaps decisive rankings so far. In fact, I'm willing to bet some of you have already tried predicting that this would be the bottom of the barrel D tier, while others are expecting a S tier. But hey, you'll have to find out next time when we cover the remainder of Fishman Island, and hear of a particular someone who drove my mind into absolute overdrive. Joy Boy. And that's the video. Oh boy, Fishman Island is truly a doozy, and based on what I've heard from you all, moving forward, multiple parts covering each arc will seemingly be the norm. But trust me when I say that I absolutely cannot wait to share all of those with you. My excitement levels for the future of One Piece are seriously off the charts. But with all that out of the way, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.